Welcome to Crime Case Vault. Today, we examine one of the most disturbing cases in criminal history, Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Monster. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer took the lives of 17 young men and boys, committing acts so disturbing that they shocked the world and changed how we understand criminal psychology. Jeffrey Dahmer was not the typical image of a dangerous criminal. He was quiet, polite, and seemingly ordinary. He worked at a chocolate factory, lived in a normal apartment building, and to casual observers appeared unremarkable. But behind closed doors, he was committing acts that would horrify investigators and expose deep failures in the criminal justice system. What makes Dahmer's case particularly significant is not just the nature of his crimes, but the systemic failures that allowed him to continue for over 13 years. Police officers returned one of his victims, a drugged, injured 14-year-old boy, to Dahmer's apartment, dismissing concerns as a domestic dispute. Neighbors complained about terrible odors and strange sounds, but their concerns were ignored. The case exposed deep problems in how law enforcement interacted with marginalized communities. This 40-minute documentary examines Jeffrey Dahmer's life from his troubled childhood to his death in prison. We will explore the warning signs that were missed, the victims whose lives were stolen, the investigation that finally stopped him, and the lasting impact his crimes had on Milwaukee and America. This is the complete story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a chemistry student who would later become a research chemist. His mother was a teletype machine instructor who struggled with mental health issues throughout Jeffrey's childhood. By most accounts, Jeffrey was a happy, energetic child until age 4. Then something changed. After undergoing surgery to correct a medical condition, a traumatic experience for a young child, Jeffrey became noticeably subdued and withdrawn. The birth of his younger brother and the family's frequent moves only deepened his isolation. Jeffrey's parents had a deeply troubled marriage. His mother Joyce suffered from depression and health anxiety. His father Lionel was often absent, consumed by his studies and later his work. The household was filled with tension and frequent arguments. Young Jeffrey learned early that his home was not a place of safety or stability. From a young age, Jeffrey Dahmer exhibited disturbing behaviors that would later be recognized as warning signs. He developed a fascination with animal bones, collecting them from the woods and studying how to clean and preserve them. He kept preserved specimens in jars in his bedroom. His father, a chemist, initially thought this was scientific curiosity, not recognizing the darker implications. By his early teens, Dahmer was completely disengaged from his peers. He was tense, friendless, and increasingly isolated. He began drinking heavily while still in high school, often showing up to class intoxicated. His alcohol dependency would be a constant throughout his life, a way to numb himself and lower his inhibitions. According to Dahmer's later statements to investigators, his dark compulsions began around age 14. He fantasized about having complete control over another person, about possessing someone so completely that they could never leave him. These fantasies grew more elaborate and disturbing as he entered his late teens. On June 18, 1978, just weeks after graduating from high school, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first homicide. His parents' marriage had finally collapsed. His mother had taken his younger brother and moved out, leaving Jeffrey alone in the family home in Bath, Ohio. His father was living elsewhere. That day, Dahmer picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks. Dahmer invited Hicks to his house for drinks, They talked for hours. But when Hicks said he needed to leave, Dahmer panicked. He didn't want him to go. In a moment of violence, he ended Stephen Hicks' life. Dahmer disposed of the remains on his family's property. Stephen Hicks' disappearance would remain a mystery for 13 years. After this first crime, Dahmer did not harm anyone else for 9 years. He joined the Army in 1979, but was discharged in 1981 due to his drinking problem. He moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother, working various jobs and trying to maintain a normal life. But his dark fantasies never went away. In September 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his second homicide. He met Stephen Chuomi at a bar in Milwaukee and invited him to a hotel room. Both men drank heavily. According to Dahmer, when he woke up the next morning, Chuomi had passed away, though he claimed to have no memory of what happened. He disposed of the remains. This incident broke whatever psychological barrier had prevented Dahmer from acting on his urges for 9 years. Over the next 4 years, he would harm 15 more young men and boys. His pattern became established: lure victims to his apartment, drug them with sleeping medication dissolved in drinks, then carry out his crimes. In 1985, Dahmer had been hired at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, working the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. This job gave him legitimate income and left his days free. His coworkers noticed that he often appeared disheveled and seemed unusual, but he was reliable at his job and kept to himself. Dahmer primarily targeted young men from marginalized communities. Most of his victims were from the LGBTQ community, many were people of color, and several were financially struggling. He frequented Milwaukee's bars and shopping areas, looking for vulnerable individuals who might be willing to come to his apartment for money, drinks, or companionship. Dahmer later stated that he selected victims based on physical appearance rather than race or background. However, the fact remained that most of his victims were from minority communities, in a city where police were often less responsive to missing persons reports from these groups. As Dahmer's crimes continued, his methods became more elaborate. He began taking Polaroid photographs of his victims at various stages. He kept these photos in his apartment, using them to relive the incidents and feed his fantasies. Dahmer also began attempting to create what he called compliant companions, individuals who would be unable to leave. He tried various harmful methods while victims were unconscious. These experiments were always fatal, but Dahmer continued trying, driven by his need for complete control. Perhaps most disturbing, Dahmer engaged in acts of desecration with remains. He later explained that he felt by doing so, his victims would become a permanent part of him, and he would never have to worry about them leaving. It was his ultimate act of possession. He kept various remains in his apartment, preserved in his refrigerator, freezer, and throughout the living space. He had a large drum filled with chemical solution. The apartment at 924 North 25th Street became a chamber of horrors that would shock even experienced homicide detectives. On May 27, 1991, an incident occurred that would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the Dahmer case. 14-year-old Konrek Synthesamphone, a Laotian boy, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment while Dahmer was out. The boy was unclothed, bleeding, and disoriented from substances Dahmer had given him. 3 women in the neighborhood found the boy and called police. When officers arrived, Dahmer, who had been searching for Konrek, calmly explained that the boy was his adult partner and that they had just had an argument. Despite the boy's obvious distress and inability to communicate clearly, and despite the women's insistence that something was wrong, police escorted Konrek back to Dahmer's apartment. The officers even entered Dahmer's apartment, where evidence of his crimes was present, but they did not search thoroughly. They dismissed the terrible odor as spoiled food. They treated the situation as a domestic dispute and wanted nothing to do with it. After the officers left, Konrak Sinthasomphone lost his life. The 3 officers involved were later fired, but not until after the full scope of Dahmer's crimes became known. The incident became a symbol of how police bias against the LGBTQ community and minorities contributed to Dahmer's ability to continue his crimes. Glenda Cleveland, an African-American woman who lived near Dahmer's apartment building, repeatedly called police to complain about suspicious activities and terrible smells. She was one of the 3 women who had found Konrak Sinthasomphone and called police. She called again after the officers left, insisting something was terribly wrong. Her calls were ignored or dismissed. Other neighbors also complained about sounds of power tools, terrible odors, and strange behavior. Dahmer explained away the smells as coming from spoiled meat in his broken freezer, or as an animal that had passed away in the ventilation system. Building management accepted these explanations without investigation. The constant complaints from predominantly minority neighbors were not taken seriously by authorities. Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal history before his arrest for homicide included several incidents that, in retrospect, were clear warning signs. In 1982, he was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair. In 1988, he was arrested for drugging and inappropriately touching Somsak Sinthasomphone, the 13-year-old brother of Konrak. Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison, but served only 10 months. He was released on probation. Dahmer was still on probation for the 1988 offense, when he committed many of his crimes between 1989 and 1991. His probation officer required monthly check-ins but never visited his apartment, as was normally required. The workload was too heavy, the officer later explained. If anyone had inspected Dahmer's apartment during this period, they would have discovered evidence and likely prevented multiple deaths. On July 22, 1991, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards was walking near the Grand Avenue Mall in Milwaukee when he encountered Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer offered Edwards money to come to his apartment for drinks and to pose for photographs. Edwards, who needed money, agreed. Once at the apartment, Edwards began to feel uncomfortable. Dahmer's behavior became increasingly strange. He tried to restrain Edwards. When Edwards resisted, Dahmer threatened him with a knife. For hours, Edwards talked to Dahmer, trying to keep him calm, waiting for an opportunity to escape. Finally, Edwards managed to strike Dahmer and flee the apartment with one restraint still attached to his wrist. He ran down the street until he flagged down a police car. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller listened to his story, and though skeptical, agreed to accompany him back to the apartment. When police knocked on Dahmer's door at apartment 213, he answered calmly and invited them inside. He tried to explain that the restraints were just part of a misunderstanding. The officers almost believed him. Dahmer was polite, articulate, and seemed reasonable, but something felt wrong. Officer Mueller asked to retrieve the key from the bedroom. When he opened the bedroom door, he saw photographs scattered on the bedside table. He picked one up and saw an image of human remains. More Polaroids showed bodies in various stages of dismemberment. Mueller shouted to his partner, and Dahmer was immediately arrested. A search of the apartment revealed a scene that shocked even veteran homicide detectives. In the refrigerator were preserved human remains. In the freezer were more evidence of his crimes. 7 skulls were found throughout the apartment. The large drum in the bedroom contained remains in chemical solution. Polaroid photographs documented everything. The smell was overwhelming. Detectives had to step outside repeatedly to breathe fresh air. One detective later said he would never forget what he saw that night when he opened that refrigerator. Jeffrey Dahmer provided a statement almost immediately. Once arrested, he seemed almost relieved. He gave detailed information about each of his 17 victims, describing his methods, his motivations, and the locations where he had disposed of evidence. His account was matter-of-fact and chilling in its lack of emotion. Dahmer explained that he harmed others because he wanted to keep them with him forever. He didn't want them to leave. By doing what he did, he felt he could possess them completely. It was about control and twisted companionship, intertwined in the mind of a deeply disturbed individual. The statement lasted for hours. Detectives were horrified, but needed every detail to identify victims and close open missing persons cases. Dahmer cooperated fully, showing no remorse but willing to provide information. He later said he felt like he had been in a dream for years and was finally waking up. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee. He was charged with 15 counts of first-degree homicide committed in Wisconsin. He pleaded guilty, but claimed he was legally insane at the time of the crimes. The trial would determine whether he was criminally responsible for his actions. The prosecution argued that Dahmer's careful planning, his ability to hold a job, his efforts to avoid detection, and his methodical disposal of evidence all demonstrated that he knew his actions were wrong and could control his behavior. Defense psychiatrists testified that Dahmer suffered from severe mental disorders that rendered him unable to control his compulsions. On February 15, 1992, after only 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane and criminally responsible. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years. Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment, so life imprisonment was the maximum sentence. Later that year, Dahmer received an additional life term for the 1978 crime in Ohio. Dahmer was initially held in isolation at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, for his own safety. But in July 1994, he was transferred to general population at his own request. He had reportedly found religion in prison and wanted to be baptized. He attended church services and claimed to be genuinely remorseful for his crimes, though many questioned the sincerity of his religious conversion. Other inmates were not forgiving. Dahmer was threatened and harassed multiple times. Some prisoners threw things at him. Others made threats openly. But Dahmer seemed strangely accepting of this treatment, as if he recognized it as punishment he deserved. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail cleaning the prison gymnasium bathrooms along with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Guards left the 3 men unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes. During that time, Christopher Scarver attacked both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Scarver later told authorities that he had been disturbed by Dahmer's behavior. Dahmer apparently made inappropriate jokes about his crimes and seemed to provoke other inmates. Scarver said he asked Dahmer if he was sorry for what he had done. When Dahmer did not answer appropriately, Scarver attacked him. Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced deceased approximately 1 hour after the attack. He was 34 years old and had served less than 3 years of his multiple life sentences. Jesse Anderson passed away 2 days later from his injuries. Christopher Scarver was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and given 2 additional life sentences. While Jeffrey Dahmer's name is infamous, we must remember his 17 victims, real people whose lives were stolen. Stephen Mark Hicks, 19 in 1978. Stephen Chuomi, 36 in 1987. Jamie Dockstader, 14. Richard Guerrero, 25. Anthony Sears, 26. Ricky Beeks, 33, Edward Smith, 28, Ernest Miller, 22, David Thomas, 23, Curtis Straughter, 18, Errol Lindsay, 19, Tony Hughes, 31, Conrad Synthesomphone, 14, Matt Turner, 20, Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, Oliver Lacey, 24, Joseph Braidhoft, 25. These were sons, brothers, friends. They had dreams and futures that were destroyed. Most came from marginalized communities, members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, those struggling economically. Their disappearances were not investigated with the urgency they deserved. Their families lived with uncertainty for years, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The Dahmer case exposed serious problems in Milwaukee law enforcement. The incident with Conrad Synthesomphone, where police returned an injured child to his attacker, became a national scandal. The case highlighted how prejudice against the LGBTQ community and minorities led to dismissive treatment of complaints and missing persons reports from these communities. Glenda Cleveland, the neighbor who repeatedly tried to warn police, became a symbol of how ordinary citizens' concerns were ignored. The systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to continue prompted reforms in how police handle missing persons cases, domestic disturbances, and complaints from marginalized communities. Jeffrey Dahmer's case has been extensively studied by criminal psychologists and forensic psychiatrists. His extreme need for control and obsessive fantasies represent one of the most severe cases of psychological disorder ever documented. Unlike many serial offenders who are psychopaths incapable of empathy, Dahmer seemed to have some capacity for understanding the wrongness of his actions. He described his crimes as being in a dreamlike state, driven by compulsions he felt powerless to resist. This has led to ongoing debates about free will, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. His case continues to be studied in criminology and psychology programs worldwide. Jeffrey Dahmer committed acts of almost unimaginable horror. His crimes were not driven by anger or hatred, but by a twisted need for companionship and control. He wanted to possess his victims so completely that they could never leave him, and he pursued this goal through the most disturbing means imaginable. The case teaches us about the dangers of societal prejudice, the importance of listening to marginalized voices, and the need for mental health intervention when warning signs appear. Dahmer exhibited classic warning signs from childhood: fascination with remains, social isolation, substance abuse, and disturbing fantasies about control. If these signs had been recognized and addressed, perhaps some of his victims might have been spared. More than 3 decades after his arrest and nearly 30 years after his death, Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most notorious criminals in American history. His story continues to fascinate and horrify, spawning books, documentaries, and dramatizations. But we must never forget that behind the sensationalism are 17 real victims and the families who loved them. Thank you for joining us on this examination of one of the darkest cases in criminal history. This has been Crime Case Vault, reminding you that behind every crime are real people whose lives matter, whose stories deserve to be told, and whose memories deserve to be honored.